The room was silent, except for the heavy, rhythmic pause of a breath that seemed to take forever to return. I remember standing by the bed at 3 in the morning, watching a man who hadn't spoken or even squeezed a hand in days. His skin was cool to the touch, and his family was huddled together in the dim lamplight, waiting for the one thing they dreaded most. Every clinical sign told me he was only minutes away from the end, and the air in the room felt thick with that final, unmistakable presence of death. His daughter looked up at me with tears in her eyes, certain that the last shallow gasp she heard was his final goodbye. And honestly, I believed her. We shared that profound, heavy silence that settles over a room when a life finally slips away into the shadows. But when I walked back into that same room the following morning, expecting to find an empty bed and a grieving family, I stopped dead in my tracks. He wasn't gone. He was sitting up, completely awake and looking directly at me with a calm I can't quite describe. He began to speak as if he had just returned from a long, tiring journey, perfectly aware of everyone around him despite being unresponsive for nearly a week. Most people would call this a miracle or a mistake in my assessment, but after years at the bedside, I've realized this isn't an accident. It's a specific, hidden pattern where the body enters a deep state of withdrawal that mimics death perfectly, yet the person is still very much there. Why does the body pause right at the threshold of the end, and what are we missing in those hours of silence? The look on his daughter's face wasn't one of pure joy. It was a haunting mix of relief and total, paralyzed confusion. They had spent the last 6 hours grieving a man they thought was already gone, whispering their final secrets into his ear and bracing for the cold silence of a funeral home. When he suddenly blinked and asked for a sip of water, the air in the room shifted from heavy mourning to a strange electric tension. It felt as if the natural laws of life and death had somehow folded in on themselves, leaving everyone wondering if they had witnessed a miracle or a terrifying mistake. In the hallways, the whispers among the staff were just as sharp, because on paper, this man's heart and lungs had practically checked out hours ago. We're taught to look for specific exit signs, the mottled skin, the cooling extremities, the rattle in the chest, and he had checked every single box with clinical precision. Yet here he was, bypassing the very end we had all prepared for, which forces us to ask a question that most medical textbooks prefer to ignore. Is it possible that what we call the final moment is actually just a door that some people walk through and then, for reasons we don't yet understand, decide to step back out of? Most people dismiss this as a surge or a final burst of energy, but what I saw in his eyes wasn't a temporary flicker. It was a profound, quiet clarity that didn't fit the typical medical narrative of a dying brain. It made me realize that we might be completely misreading the silence of the dying, treating a deep internal processing phase as if the person has already left the building. This gap between our clinical observations and the patient's actual experience creates a mystery that changes everything we think we know about the threshold. If he wasn't actually gone during those hours of silence, then where exactly was he? And what was his body doing while it appeared to be shutting down forever? The breathing is the first thing that tricks you. It becomes this irregular, heavy cycle where the chest rises, falls, and then nothing. You count the seconds, 5, 10, 15, waiting for that next intake of air that feels like it's being pulled from miles away. His skin had taken on that waxy, grayish hue, and his fingernails were starting to turn a ghostly blue. To any observer, these are the final signatures of a body surrendering, a machine finally running out of fuel. But looking back, I realize we were watching a performance of departure, not the departure itself. We call this the active phase, but in these specific cases, it feels more like a deep, internal hibernation. The patient is completely unreachable. You can call their name or squeeze their hand, but there's no flicker in the eyes or change in the heart rate. It's a silence so profound, it feels like the person has already stepped out of the room, leaving only the physical shell behind to finish the chores of shutting down. Yet, underneath that icy exterior, something is still humming, a quiet processing that our monitors simply aren't sensitive enough to pick up. This is where the mystery deepens, because we often see the death rattle, that gurgling sound in the throat, and assume it's a sign of distress or immediate passing. In reality, it's often just the body's way of relaxing, but it creates this terrifying illusion that the end is a struggle, What's truly strange is how the body can maintain this near-death state for hours or even days, as if it's waiting for a specific signal or a final piece of internal work to be completed. It makes you wonder, if the body is this good at pretending to be gone, what else is it doing in that hidden space between breaths? When a family sits by that bed, every labored breath feels like a hammer blow to their hearts. They hear that rattling sound in the throat and immediately assume their loved one is drowning or fighting for air. I've seen daughters clutch their father's hand, begging me to give him more morphine because they are convinced he is in agony. To them, the silence isn't peaceful. It looks like a violent struggle against an invisible force, a sign that something has gone terribly wrong in these final hours. But here is where the medical reality clashes with what we see on the surface. We are taught to fear these signs, yet the patient's face often remains eerily calm despite the noise their body is making. It's a jarring contrast, a physical storm on the outside, while the person inside seems to be drifting in a quiet ocean. What we perceive as a desperate fight for life is often just the body's mechanics winding down, a process that is far less painful than it appears. This is the moment that changes everything for those of us at the bedside. If it isn't pain and it isn't suffering, then what is the body doing during those long, hollow pauses? We often mistake the finish line for a place of distress, but that's a profound misunderstanding. It turns out that the heavy silence we fear isn't a sign of failure. It's actually a necessary, hidden bridge the mind builds before the end. But why does the body stay on that bridge for so long? When we see a patient's hands turn cold or their fingernails take on a bluish tint, our first instinct is to think the body is simply failing. But in reality, it's doing something incredibly strategic. It's pulling all its remaining energy away from the extremities to protect the core, the heart, and the brain. It's not a collapse, it's a consolidation. This is why the skin feels like ice, even when the person inside isn't actually cold. It's a tactical retreat we often mistake for the end. Then there are those long, heavy pauses in breathing that make everyone in the room hold their own breath in sympathy. We often call this a struggle, but it's actually a rhythmic reset of the nervous system. The brain is shifting its priorities, moving away from the constant demand for oxygen toward a slower, deeper state of existence. It looks like gasping, but for the patient, it's more like a slow-motion drift. It's the body's way of finding a new, final tempo. During these hours of deep unresponsiveness, we often assume the person has already checked out because they don't react to our touch. But this level of consciousness isn't a void, it's a deep, internal hibernation. I've seen time and again how a patient can be unreachable for days, only to suddenly open their eyes with total clarity. They aren't coming back from the dead. They are simply stepping out of an intense internal processing phase. The mind is busy, even when the body looks empty. When you see these signs together, the cooling skin, the rhythmic breaths, and the deep internal retreat, a clear pattern emerges. This isn't a chaotic breakdown. It's a highly organized, biological transition that follows a roadmap we are only just beginning to understand. We often misinterpret these signals as distress because we are looking at them through the lens of life, not the lens of crossing over. And that's the part that changes everything. Once you recognize the pattern, the mystery starts feeling like a purposeful journey. I remember a specific night around 3 a.m. that challenged everything I thought I knew about the final transition. Mr. Miller had been unresponsive for days, his body showing every classic sign that the end was just minutes away. His hands were like ice, and those long, agonizing gaps between his breaths made the silence in the room feel heavy, almost suffocating. His daughter sat by the bed, clutching his hand, her face a mask of exhausted grief as we both waited for the inevitable. Then, the breathing just stopped. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, in that profound, hallowed silence that usually signals a life has finally slipped away. I watched his chest, looking for even the slightest flicker of movement, but there was nothing. His daughter looked at me with tears streaming down her face, whispering her final, "I love you," convinced her father was gone. In that moment, even with all my years of experience, I was certain we had reached the very end of his story. But death has a way of following its own mysterious clock, and the next morning, the scene was completely transformed. Instead of an empty room, I found Mr. Miller sitting up, his eyes clear and focused for the first time in a week. He wasn't just lingering, he was fully present, speaking to his family with a calm that felt like he had just returned from a long, peaceful journey. It was as if his body had paused at the threshold, entering a withdrawal so deep it perfectly mimicked the end. The shock on his family's faces was a haunting mix of absolute joy and total, paralyzed confusion. They had already started the grieving process, yet here he was, asking for a sip of water and acknowledging everyone in the room by name. This wasn't a medical error or a random fluke. It was a glimpse into a hidden, internal processing phase we often misinterpret as the final breath. It makes you wonder what else is happening in that quiet space that our monitors simply cannot see. We spend so much of our lives fearing these final signs, looking at the cooling skin and the heavy silence as if they are the enemies of the person we love. But what if we've been looking at a map and reading the symbols all wrong? That stillness isn't a void, and those long pauses aren't a struggle for air. They are the markers of a body gracefully stepping back to let the soul finish its work. It's a profound shift in perspective that turns a terrifying clinical collapse into a sacred, quiet preparation for something we can't yet see. Understanding that the body isn't failing, but rather focusing its last strength on the spirit, transforms our fear into a different kind of presence. We no longer have to panic at the silence. We can simply hold the space for it. If you have ever sat in that specific heavy quiet and felt something you couldn't quite explain, please share that experience with us in the comments. Your stories are the pieces of the map we are building together to make this journey less lonely for everyone else who is still searching for answers. In the end, the most important thing I've learned isn't found in a medical textbook, but in the calm eyes of patients like Mr. Miller. They aren't lost in the dark. They are finding their way home in their own time and on their own terms. It's a quiet, beautiful mystery that reminds us that even in the deepest silence, love is never truly out of reach. This is the truth that changes everything.